Hi, so today you're reading pages 164 to 167 in your book, and we'll be going over the demographic transition model. And it can be a bit confusing, and there's a lot of vocabulary that it's kind of assumed you're already familiar with when we deal with this. Make sure you're asking, particularly if it's not like on your reading quiz, if it's not a word that's being exactly quizzed, but you're not sure exactly what it means. Make sure you're asking so I can make sure that we have all the information that you need. As you've probably noticed, this class as a whole has a ton of vocabulary. So I would recommend working on flashcards or making a vocab notebook on your own to study. We have to move through the content quickly, so I don't really have time to give you a full vocab list to give you as homework. But if you're struggling with the quizzes and the tests and remembering these things, flashcards would be a great tool. There's a lot of Quizlet sets that have already been made in this class. So maybe search for one made by a teacher and use that to study. But there is tons and tons and tons of vocab in this class. So when we're looking at the demographic transition model, we're looking at a model that currently consists of 4 stages, but we're adding a 5th. It's kind of in the works. That helps to explain the rising and falling of a natural increase in population over time in the country. And so you do look at it, it's for terms as like one country. You don't look at the global transition model. It doesn't exist. So it's meant to look at a country or a region. So far, no country has ever gone back to a previous stage. So at this point, the model is a progressive model, meaning it has a beginning, a middle, and an end stage. And again, that end stage is changing, right? So we talk about 4 stages, but there really is a 5th stage that's pretty well established, and we'll add to that in tomorrow's reading. So this is the model that you've been looking at, hopefully in your book. Some of you had this one for your speed date research activity, so you've got a little bit of a head start. So you can see that the country would progress from stage 1, and this would be a pre-agricultural society. There are no countries in stage 1 today. There are populations within a country that might be in stage 1, but there are no countries on the planet today at stage 1. You can see that the population growth, so there's multiple lines here, right? See, the brown line is the natural increase of the population. So that NIR or RNI. So this shows you if the population is growing, and in stage 1 it's not. It's a slowly growing or stable population, and it's slowly growing or stable because even though they have a high birth rate, they have a really high death rate. And so this high birth rate and high death rate mean that the population is staying about the same size. But then as you hit stage 2, you're moving into a fully agricultural society. And this is a time of high population growth. So when you hit stage 2, the natural increase rate starts to go up. And as you can see, the birth rate stays pretty stable. And maybe it gets a little more consistently in the higher range, but it stays pretty close to the same. But the number of deaths drops. So people start to live longer. You start to have lower rates of child mortality, maternal mortality, and infant mortality. And so the death rate starts to decline. And so it's the declining death rate that really leads to this high natural increase. So you still have a high birth rate, but you have a much lower death rate. Then you move into stage 3. And these would be newly industrialized countries, or if you think about like a less developed country, if you think of one that has like lots of factories, it's a manufacturing-based country. This is something like maybe like Brazil, Mexico, China. Their population growth starts to decline. And it's because they have a decline in birth rates. So the death rates are still declining all the way through stage 3, but the birth rates start to decline. And it's because they have access to healthcare. It's because they have access to education. So particularly women have access to education, so they start having children later in life. In a country where women aren't educated, you might have your first child at 14 or 15. In a country where women are going to college, you're not going to start having your first child on average until your 20s. The average age for a woman to have her first child in the United States now is 28. So we have we delay childbirth, which means we have less children over time. And we don't have to have as many children. We don't need them to work in a farm for us anymore. and our children are more likely to survive. So as you're moving through this, and your culture becomes acclimated to it, if you no longer need people to work on your farm, so children become more expensive, and if you are more likely to have children survive to adulthood, you don't have to have 8 children in the hopes that a few of them survive. You know, you could have 2 kids, and most likely they'll live on to adulthood. So your birth rate is declining, but again, it's declining in a good way. This number of individuals born has nothing to do with infant mortality, not directly. And then your death rate is still decreasing. And then in stage 4, you've reached a post-industrial era. So we've moved less from manufacturing, more into like service-based economies, more things like retail jobs and restaurants and government jobs like lawyers and doctors. These are all service-based jobs. And you're going to see that the growth rate, the natural increase rate, which started to decline in stage 3, is now really low. So now we're at low growth again. You see the birth rate has decreased. It's decreasing still throughout the stage, and then it's starting to level off. And you might see the death rate increase a little bit. So sometimes they draw it where it's straight across, and sometimes you'll see it where it increases a little bit. And so why does the death rate go up a little bit in stage 4? Because people are living to be older. And if you begin to have an aging population, so once you have people who are living past their 50s and 60s, eventually you're going to have an increase in death rate because you have more elderly people. And, humans, eventually we just die. Like there's a limit to our life. In addition to the demographic transition model, in class, we're going to go over the epidemiological transition model. And it's mentioned in your book, and we'll go over it in more detail in class this week. But the epidemiological transition model accounts for changes in population growth rates that are caused by medical advances. And so we're going to look at patterns of what are people dying of, why are they dying of it. So we'll be able to work some disease patterns into this as well. And then migration, when we start migration in about a week, we'll also be able to account for migration patterns into this model. So we'll also have a migration transition model. So we can kind of keep building on this demographic transition model. And this is going to be in both geography and AP environmental. So this is a really important thing. We're going to keep coming back to it. It's important that that both the demographic transition model and the epidemiological transition model are going to help us predict the future changes in a population. But they also tell us a lot about the history of a country, particularly the economic history. And so you can see on the demographic transition model when the Industrial Revolution occurred if you were looking at the demographic transition model of Great Britain or the UK today. You could see it in the United States, when we're making these transitional steps. So for us, you'd see the Industrial Revolution popping, for us, the Industrial Revolution really started a little bit later than it did in England. But you can see that it really took off right around the Civil War era and continued until the 1950s, right? Where we then hit this deindustrialization area. And then our transition into service-based economy. So you can see that history as you look at the demographic transition model. And I know there's lots of vocab in here, so make sure you're reviewing it, asking questions if you need help. But we have things like newly industrialized countries in there. And again, you maybe have heard them called less developed countries, or maybe you've heard them referred to as, sometimes they refer to them as first world. But I feel like that newly industrialized, first of all, it's not offensive. And it really better describes a country like Mexico or China or India or Brazil or Russia that has a huge manufacturing center, large capital cities, and they still have a big gap between the amount of rural and urban individuals and the amount of services available to them. But I think that newly industrialized countries definitely is a better descriptor than less developed, because it really kind of puts these countries into this realm of, yes, you are definitely in stage 3. And then a more developed country would be, these are countries that have gone through stage 4, possibly into the stage 5 that we'll talk about later. Now you're looking at U.S. Now you're looking at most countries in Europe, Japan. And so we will go over this in class a bit more. We're going to go through it step by step also in tomorrow's reading. So if you're having trouble, we're looking at just the general pattern right now. And we'll go into it in more detail for tomorrow night's reading. One more thing that your book talks about is the S-curve for logistic growth. So when you have a population, it's growing pretty fast, right? And this looks a lot like the demographic transition model if you're looking at that NIR line. So you see it's growing really fast, and then it reaches its carrying capacity. So when a population exceeds its carrying capacity, it has exceeded what it can, the amount of resources that it has access to. And then the population would then stabilize. And so you can see within different countries when population growth starts to stabilize. So again, this is the S-curve.